Hello, my name's Faye and in June I only read 4-star books. So in this little recap of my reading month, I'll try to somehow differentiate between these 6 really solidly good books, working my way up from what I liked the least to the most. But we are in the 4-star realm, starting off with Love Again by Doris Lessing, which we read for book club. Even though I really had to rush and I read this book in sort of 2.5 days, I did take my time with it. I tabbed, I annotated a little bit, and that in itself was a lovely experience for me. I don't tend to do that, and I actually marked within a book, which is unheard of for me. But in this, I believe 1996 published book, Doris Lessing, who later would win the Nobel Prize for Literature, writes about Sarah Dunham, who's in her 60s. She is a producer of plays. She founded a theatre with 3 of her friends, and together they work better together than each of them individually. I'm distracted here because I actually wanted to find you one of these quotes to talk about the elements that resonated the most with me. It says here on page 11, so I'm not spoiling much. This is just explaining this theatre company that they run. She says, other theatres tried to lure him away but failed, talking about one of her friends and colleagues. For these 4 shared a belief that their talents together were larger than they could ever be apart. And even though in Love Again, we hear about this woman in her 60s who falls in love romantically with different men and has this sort of renaissance of feeling love and lust again after her husband died in her 40s. She spent a long time as a widow taking care of their young children by herself. Now she has these urges again. Even though it is about that on the forefront, I cared for the elements of friendship much more in this book, and how those relationships can be far more profound and lasting and meaningful than lustiness or romantic love. I did highlight multiple parts in this book, but the parts that dealt with the friendship, like they sat on in silence, knowing their thoughts ran on parallel lines, 263, they really touched me the most. On the whole, this book was quite unpopular in our book club. It doesn't have any chapters, and the form in which this was written, I also found pretty challenging. You don't really get a break. The story spans quite a lot of characters and scenes, countries even, but because there is no structure enforced through chapters, you do get a little bit lost. Their theatre house puts on a play about the fictitious character Julie Véran. I should say she's fictitious in this book. She exists and is the daughter of, I believe, a plantation owner and a slave somewhere in the 18th century in France, maybe. And that is done in such a clever way, like tying together this supposedly real life case with a play that they then put on. We all in our book club went on to Google Julie Véran only to find out that Doris Lessing made her up. There's so much going on in here. You can really talk about feminist literature in the 90s and how some of it has aged. For instance, slight spoiler, we did want our character Sarah, who's in her 60s and is thus a voice that we all hadn't, a perspective we hadn't read of that much. We all wanted her to get more steamy action. We're kind of cheering her on that she sort of feels this lust again after decades of not being very interested in men, and then we were a bit disappointed by where this goes. Some of the characters are so believable. There are some very privileged white men in this, and I kind of rooted for them and got mocked for that in book club. But yeah, Doris Lessing, Love Again, I think It was a book that was really interesting to read. I'm not going to rush to read more Doris Lessing, to be honest, but I am glad that I read it. Similarly, Daheim by Judith Hermann, which has also been translated into English, but I read the German copy. She's a very popular German author who's written multiple novels. This one, I believe, was published 2 years ago. And it's about a woman who moves to somewhere to the North Sea, I reckon, in Germany, trying to find a new home, make her own home. She lives in this village. She works in a pub that her brother owns, and she makes friends with a neighbour. And the plot is not that important. It is more about this woman in her maybe 50s, we're not sure, finding a new home, sort of starting over. And it's not kitschy and rosy, but there is a sort of gust of fresh air, northern, sort of more melancholy fresh air that goes through her life. I thought this was really atmospheric. I listened to this on audiobook for like parts of the story, and the author herself reads the German audiobook. And she does put a lot of sort of slow, lyrical emphasis on some of these sentences, which was a little too much for my liking. And there is a side plot with the protagonist's brother leading a relationship with a young, very troubled woman. And that was too dramatic for my liking. I thought that kind of was at odds with the sort of more quiet lyrical storytelling, and that was sort of made for TV almost. So I didn't love that aspect of it, but on the whole, I really felt like I was swimming in the cold ocean together with our protagonist and her new close friend, Mimi, her neighbour, who is an artist. Yeah, I really appreciated this one. Another 4-star read, maybe one that I liked a little bit more, was 10 minutes 38 seconds in This Strange World by Elif Shafak, who is a British-Turkish author, I believe. And I read this together with Anna, and I was really quite reluctant to read another Elif Shafak book because I read a dinky small little non-fiction book by her, which I didn't love, 2 years ago maybe. In this, we follow Layla, who grows up in an extremely religious conservative family somewhere rurally in Turkey, and she has always wanted to escape to Istanbul. She does, but on the very first page of our book, Layla dies, and in lying there dead, we follow the 10 minutes 38 seconds following her death, as she sort of flits chronologically through memories. So we get to know about her awful childhood and how she ended up in Istanbul and dead in a dumpster. That's sort of the first 2/3 of this book, and then I don't want to spoil too much. Have I already? We also get to know Layla's group of friends, 4 of her closest friends, and together they are sort of the 5, this beautiful found family, which is a trope that I think is my very, very favourite. And all of those parts were amazing and really quite action-packed, and were at quite extreme odds to her awful childhood. And I talked about this with Anna, obviously, after we read it together, and Anna really loved the part with her friends and felt like she was really connected to the friends, while she felt like she didn't really get to know Layla. I felt differently. I felt like we got to know one version of Layla, but we didn't get to know the version that her friends loved. And that was a weird mismatch which I did find quite interesting in this book, because I do love this idea of being able to distance yourself and reinvent yourself after spending a childhood and youth that was terrible and also not your fault. So I thought this was a really, really strong one. I do want to read from more diverse countries and authors, and this one I will be counting for Turkey. There's like a map of Istanbul in the front. It was also wonderful having read this book, because I did go to Turkey less than 10 years ago, more than 10 years ago. Oh God, it's been a while. But I did remember some of the places that she mentions in Istanbul. Apparently there's been quite a lot of discussion around Elif Shafak and her sort of political stance. I've not looked into it, I'm gotta admit. I'm really just judging this book by the book, which I really enjoyed. Elif Shafak has written more since having published this, and I think I will check it out. Maybe not this year, because, you know, Turkey's ticked off. That's like an awful side effect of me challenging myself to read from more countries. I do then find myself disregarding countries that I like ticked off, which is silly. But there's so many books and so little time. So Elif Shafak, a strong 4-star. I really liked it. And then basically within a day, I read Sempre Susan by Sigrid Nunez, a memoir of Susan Sontag. And in this, Sigrid Nunez basically writes about a year in their joint life, where she, as a young woman in New York City, worked for Sigrid Nunez as a sort of personal assistant, and starts a relationship with Sigrid Nunez's son, who also lives in this apartment that Sigrid Nunez basically moves into. It's all a bit incestuous, but given the setting, like the 70s in New York City, in this sort of academic, literary, snobby cohort, it kind of made sense. I actually found it quite believable. I really liked the language of Sigrid Nunez, and I do have something unread fiction by Sigrid Nunez on my bookshelves that I am now quite eager to get to. I am, however, not that eager to get to reading some of Susan Sontag's books. She's mainly known for non-fiction. She does touch on her fiction not being loved particularly by the critics in this, which I thought was interesting. And I do think it is fascinating writing a sort of very short memoir about someone who you knew very closely and you didn't part on very good terms with before they died. And Susan Sontag's illness, cancer, is in this as well. So I feel like this could have gone awfully wrong by being quite tactless, but somehow Sigrid Nunez pulls it off. It's an incredibly quick read. I read this on a Friday night at home with period pain and 2 dogs cuddled up next to me, and it was a lovely way to sort of spend 2 hours. A book that took considerably longer to read was Emma by Jane Austen, and I feel like I read this a little too early. July on BookTube is very much dedicated to reading Jane Austen, so this was premature. I noted the 3 volumes that my edition was published in, and this is my 4th Jane Austen that I read. And we follow Emma, who loves matchmaking, lives together with her widower father, is quite content. They have a few good friends, they have a lot of money, and she has a very carefree life. Matchmaking and talking to her best friend. And then she stumbles across this young woman, Harriet, and decides she's going to polish her and find her a good mate and improve this woman's life. The movie Clueless, the 90s movie Clueless, is a retelling of Jane Austen's Emma, which I loved as a young teenager. My mom told me that that was the retelling, which I wasn't fully aware of. But knowing that going into the book, I loved Emma because I saw, was it Alicia Silverstone, the actress who plays Clueless? I saw her and I loved her, so I loved Emma. But my friend Christy, who I read this with, really said she didn't get the character. She thought she was so unlikable, and I guess she is. She's spoiled and clueless. But I was so positively biased towards her. The character that I didn't vibe with was George Knightley. George Knightley is a visitor in Emma's house very, very regularly. He is her sister's husband's brother. Does that make him her brother-in-law? And him I found incredibly condescending. And my friend Christy, again, thought he was kind of funny. So this just goes to show that there's a character for everyone in Jane Austen novels. I'd be quite interested in reading a few retellings because I feel like in Emma, compared to some of the other novels by Jane Austen that I have read, some of the side characters are really, really interesting. I loved Emma's father, for instance. He's a complete hypochondriac, but so lovely and doesn't say anything bad about anyone. Is just worried about everyone. I don't know, I thought he was so lovely. And then there's the character of Jane Fairfax, who Emma is very sort of jealous of. Everyone thinks she is so cultured and so clever. And she totally deserves her own book as well. So there's so much you could go, like so many places you could go with this story. And I'm so glad I've read the classic and would be quite interested in retellings. If you know any other Emma retellings, except for Clueless, obviously, yeah, let me know. And then the last book that I read that I'm rating the highest out of all my June reads so far, I've already returned to my mum, and that's Matrix by Lauren Groff. In this, we follow young Marie, how she is basically exiled to a nunnery by the Queen, somewhere in the, ooh, is it like 12th century in France? I don't know, it really helps me to hold a book and look things up. But we follow her, how she, over the course of her life, runs this nunnery. And it's so fascinating. We basically watch her create this matriarchal community. It's such an unexpected book. Lauren Groff has this way of writing really authentic characters, believable characters rather, that are neither good or bad. And therefore you root for them much more. Marie is really infatuated by this young queen where she grew up in her court as a child. Basically, she is tragically, passionately, desperately, hopelessly in love with her. So it's also a queer story set in the Middle Ages, mixed with emotions of like revenge. It's so fascinating. It puts women at the center of the story at a time when that doesn't tend to happen. I read very little historical fiction because I often either find I am not interested in just reading about men or women who are treated badly, or women who sort of romanticize an unemancipated lifestyle. I don't know, like those are my prejudices towards a lot of historical fiction. Matrix, however, is so unique, so different. I really, really loved it. Maybe this will open my eyes up a little bit to historical fiction. I have read historical fiction, and quite a few of the books that I've read I've loved. Matrix being one of them. But yeah, maybe let me know about some recommendations that you would have about historical fiction that are not sexist, basically. So yeah, I read some really, really good books, but unfortunately, I'm still this far away from giving a book 5 stars. Maybe next month. I hope you read some really, really good books this month as well. I feel like I'm back in my reading mojo after a bit of a lull. I hope you're doing really well. Bye.